Ganja and Hess is a 1973 released experimental horror film directed by Bill Gunn.
It stars Dwayne Jones as an anthropologist by the name of Hess Green. He's sort of looking into an African tribe who had like an addiction to blood. He gets a new research assistant by the name of George Meader. George is a little bit unstable and he decides to stab Hess with a sort of ancient dagger, which happens to be infected with some sort of disease that then gives Hess this same thirst for blood. So he doesn't die, he sort of resurrects as a vampire. The film never actually says the word vampire, but he does have this thirst for blood or an addiction to blood. I don't want to go too many spoilers, but this doesn't happen too far into the film. So George then kills himself and his widow comes looking for him by the name of Ganja, hence Ganja and Hess, then begins a relationship with Hess. The plot isn't particularly dense, shall we say, but figuring out what exactly is happening, even though it is quite a simple plot, is maybe not as easy as you would expect.
So yeah, I mean, where do we start with this one? There's quite a lot to devour with it.
Nice pun.
Yeah, love it. So I'd never seen this one before. You mentioned this one, so I guess we can quickly kind of start to say you may have noticed a bit of a theme here over the last couple of weeks. We are stuck with the black cinema theme. We thought we'd do a few more films. We might do a month of black cinema.
Yeah.
So next week we'll do a fourth and final one. So this is one that I had heard of. But I've never watched this one before, and you mentioned that we should. You wanted to do this one.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was looking for sort of black films to check out. This one got mentioned. It had pretty good reviews. Not sure whether I regret it or not, but.
Right, because I watched it and so I thought it was a masterpiece.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I was just like, I mean, I watched it today, so I picked up the same Blu-ray as you. It's up my street, this one. I mean, it's a vampire story, a bit kind of a strange vampire story, but I'm a big fan of vampire. And what I think we mentioned this because we did Thirst way back at the beginning of lockdown, which seems like, God, 5, 6, 7 years ago now. But we did.
It wasn't that long ago, was it?
It wasn't that long ago, no. But we did Thirst, which is another vampire film, and we spoke in that about very briefly about vampire films.
That's quite an unconventional vampire film, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting with vampire films are, I mean, I'm not personally a big fan of zombie films. There are some great ones. Of course, I suppose the definitive zombie film, Night of the Living Dead, of course, features Dwayne Jones from this film. But what I find with vampire films is you can do so much with the symbolism and the visuals with it. I mean, it's so like, and of course they do that in this one. It's so like the story of Christ. There's so many. Obviously, the cross is featured a lot, and blood and mortality, and there's very many kind of metaphors you can do with the story of Christ within vampirism. So it kind of delves into black culture and black society and lust and addiction. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of kind of allegory. It's very similar to being addicted to drugs. I mean, it's very experimental, this film. There's lots of kind of amazing sound effects and imagery. And a lot of the time you watch it and you're like, what is going on? But I think
yes, that happens a lot.
Yeah, but I think that's what's great about experimental cinema is it's there to be kind of watched again and again and to kind of work out. I mean, I think Bill Gunn himself. I watched a couple of the things on the disc, the extras, and people were saying because Bill Gunn died in 1989, I think. The producer of the film was talking about how he was a very intellectual man, but he was very inspired by someone like Ingmar Bergman, who would talk about. He'd kind of put very symbolic things in his films, but then when people asked about them, he was like, "I'm not going to tell them what they mean. They can literally work out what those symbols are for themselves." This film is full of just incredibly rich visuals and I mean, there's strange. They do kind of like there's lots of weird reverberations with the sound and echoes and then it cuts in with, strange camera angles. I mean, I think the cinematographer literally was told that he could kind of have free reign on what he could do and was allowed to really kind of get to grips with it. Yeah, it's just full of so much to take in.
I agree. I mean, it was visually, there was some amazing shots in there and, loads of interesting stuff to look at. Like you say, there's lots of metaphors for things and symbolism, and and it was obviously intentionally ambiguous, but some of it was like, do you have to make everything ambiguous? I would say it definitely requires more than one viewing to really get the most out of it. Even the start of the film, it has some text come up that explains what, who he is, what he does, and this fact that he's been stabbed, and it's transferred this, this blood addiction into him, telling you that he's a vampire without actually saying the word vampire. There's a voiceover as well, isn't there, that talks about his addiction, like that's already happened. So then you're like, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes into the film, then it happens. So you're like, what's happening? I didn't realise that was the event that had been talked about, like 20, 25 minutes ago. So for a moment I was like, what's happening? I thought that event was supposed to have happened, off screen before the start of the film. So I didn't twig immediately that that's what was going on. So it's like, oh, I see. So which is a very odd way to start a film with text. Usually that leads you into the film. If you're going to do that, I don't know, to pick a pop culture reference, Star Wars. The scroll at the start tells you everything you need to know and puts you straight in the action. There's nothing in the text that then happens in the film. It's all in the past. And that is traditionally what the purpose of that is. But in this film, it's describing something that then happens later in the film, which rendering it kind of pointless. For me, a bit confusing. But I'm probably nitpicking, but it. But
yeah, I can see what you mean. Like I said at the beginning, when I introduced the film, it's an experimental horror film. Experimental, very, very many experimental films. The idea behind them is to kind of, move away from the norm and play with narrative and flip things on its head.
As a piece of art, it is. Yeah, it's something special. But as a film, if you were looking for a traditional structured film, it isn't really. No,
if you're looking for a structured film, a traditional structured film, you're not going to get that here
with some sort of normal narrative that makes sense. Then
no, not at all. But if you're looking for a film that challenges you in more ways than one, then this film will certainly do that. But I think the original. So I think what it was the way they got the money to do the film was they spoke to Bill Gunn and he wanted, I think he'd made a short film and he wanted to make his first feature film.
So he made a film called Stop, which I think was screened a few times, but was never actually officially released because the studio didn't like it.
So then he was given the opportunity to make a feature film when the producers came a knocking and said, we've got this kind of black vampire film. I think Blackula had come out.
Blackula, yeah. Basically, he wanted another Blackula, didn't they?
Yeah, the early days of blaxploitation cinema had hit, and they were a bit of success. And so he thought, it's not really what I want to do. But then he realised that he could write something really interesting, and he could actually bring in a lot of, kind of black culture and society and look at something completely different, while at the same time making this film about vampires. So obviously blaxploitation and many other films, non-blaxploitation films, black people were obviously the only ever time they were on screen was in a kind of stereotypical way.
Yeah.
Or as killers, or as criminals and things like that. Whereas he wanted to put them into his film and give them something to say. And so they're actually there's some very intellectual conversations. There's a whole sequence, there's a party that takes place, and Dwayne Jones is talking to a young boy who I thought they referred to him as his son, but I wasn't sure.
Well, they did, yeah.
They did, didn't they? Yeah.
Again, something that is never really mentioned.
Never really mentioned, no, exactly. But they're talking French to each other, so they have this whole kind of conversation in French. So there's lots of things. There's some incredible kind of playing with the language that I really enjoyed. There's a great moment at the very beginning of the film when Bill Gunn, who plays Mida, his assistant, he's up in a tree. It's before that. It's when they're sitting at the fireplace and they're drinking together, and he talks about the use of the word cut, and a filmmaker who uses obviously the word cut when he's making a film, but he's doing it in Holland, and in Holland the word cut actually means something else. I'm not going to say what it is here. But it's kind of, there's loads of kind of, between all these experimental visuals and sound effects, There were very long takes of dialogue, but really interesting conversations that are being had.
I mean, what I
So
would say about that part, I mean, a lot of his parts feel very improvised, and
yeah,
whether that, I mean, I think it possibly was.
yeah,
Just the look of it and that almost made it feel almost a little bit like a student film. Yeah, like I said, I'm not trying to say that as a sort of
negative.
a negative thing, but that's kind of. Do you know what I mean? Where I'm coming from when I say that?
I, I think so. I mean, you're right. There was a lot of improvisation going on. I know, for instance, Marley and Clark certainly improvised a lot, and a lot of the people were given kind of free roam to really do what they want. It was a
Yeah.
very collaborative piece. I mean, I know all films are very collaborative, but this one felt even more so, I think. And yes, there was a lot of improvisation. I mean, I don't know whether I would think of it as I mean, they feel like they're all quite accomplished people in their craft.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think I know. I think I know what you mean and where you're coming from, definitely. But I didn't see it. I mean, that whole sequence with Bill Gunn, I found incredibly intense. I mean, there's a whole moment. So he goes. I think he gets drunk, and then, like I said, he winds up in this tree, and he's talking. There's a very funny line in there actually, where Dwayne Jones says. It's kind of there's a lot of it's quite paranoid. I mean, obviously, I mean, the title of the film is Ganja and Hess, so it refers to drugs, although drugs aren't specifically mentioned in the film, much like vampirism isn't mentioned. But I think the vampire addiction is like the drug addiction, and so there's lots of paranoia in there because obviously drugs can be there can be a very paranoid thing. And there's this scene that he's in this tree and he's like, Dwayne Jones is asking, kind of finding out what's going on. He's like, I'm neurotic. And Dwayne Jones says, what does that actually mean? And he's like, well, it actually means that this has nothing to do with you, which I thought was a very funny line because the whole sequence felt very intense. And he's basically, the whole idea of being neurotic is just in yourself. And it was just such a simple clarification of what that meant. But then after that, there's this very weird scene where Bill Gunn is just talking off. He's on screen, and there's like a picture there's a painting of a woman up in the right hand corner. There's a murder that has taken place about killing someone, but he's got there's what looks
yeah,
like
yeah. Well, he's got
snot
like snot or something
coming down
out
from his nose, and I was like, is that real? And I was like, because it was making me feel a bit uncomfortable because I find things like that a bit repulsive.
Yes.
And I kept having to look away from it. And he's there. He's kind of sort of staring. He's not staring at you. He's staring at He's supposed to be looking at Dwayne Jones, I think. But it's a very intense scene. And I found out later that it was actually it was real mucus hanging down from his face.
It looked real.
So it just I mean, very very intense performance and really off-putting. And his whole sequence is just I found quite disturbing actually, and really played into the whole kind of the paranoia. But I thought it was I mean I thought it was really interesting, and there's some great stuff in it. I watched it twice today. I watched it once, and then I watched it straight afterwards with the commentary by some of the crew and the cast, which was fascinating, and it was really interesting listening to although unfortunately they had the composer on there, a man named Sam Whalon. Although sadly he didn't talk about the music or the sound effects at all, which I was hoping he would do. But the cinematographer is there, and some of the stuff that happened. There's an amazing scene in a field where Dwayne Jones is in there and he's praying. And while they were filming that, there was an eclipse, and the eclipse happens while they're filming. So this whole field goes dark, and it's not an effect that they happen to put over. He just said it's like the one and only time he's ever kind of filmed a scene where something like that magically has happened. And I think again that kind of gives this kind of power to the film.
And it has, it does have like a sort of otherworldly, dreamlike,
very
quality
dreamlike
to it.
Yeah.
I didn't love it as much as you, I don't think, but I can certainly appreciate it, as a piece of art. So yeah, so he made it for this new production company called Kelly Jordan Enterprises. The two guys that owned it, I don't think they'd made any, hadn't produced any films yet. So he kind of took advantage of that. They wanted this sort of blaxploitation, Blackula copycat kind of thing to just chuck out and make a load of money on. I think they gave him $350,000. And at first he was like, oh, I don't, it's not really what I want to do. But I think once he realised he could kind of tell them he was going to make that kind of film, but then not really deliver that kind of film. He went away and just made whatever he wanted to, and pretty much was able to, because they were, production-wise, they weren't very experienced. So, of course, when he turned it in, they weren't very pleased about it, and he didn't. The critics ripped it apart in the States. So he took it to Cannes and played it in Critics Week. They loved it over there, unsurprisingly. To be honest, they ate it up and absolutely adored it. The production company then sold it to another company, who then completely recut it and cut out half an hour of footage, replaced a load of footage with, they took everything that he'd filmed, including all the stuff that wasn't in the movie, and just completely recut it into a completely different film, which, to be honest, was closer to what he'd originally agreed to make. That's what then was put into the cinemas. I think originally it was called Blood Couple.
There's a few different.
There's loads of different names, yeah. And then I think once The Exorcist did really well the following year, they then re-released it again under the name of Double Possession. So it's just shameless, really, isn't it? Bill Gunn actually gave a copy of the original, his original vision, to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and they held on to it. And over the years, they did show it every so often. It had this sort of mythical reputation that it was, this work of art that it was very difficult to watch until these Blu-rays came out. I think it was released on DVD sometime in the noughties, I think 2006, I think. Sadly, obviously after Bill Gunn had passed away several years earlier.
And Dwayne Jones as well, he died, I think, in 88. And then Bill Gunn went the year after, I think. So obviously, recently we've been doing Amazon Prime films, but we both picked up the Eureka Masters of Cinema version of it.
Yeah, I mean, as well, you've mentioned some of the features already. I mean, it's got the DVD and the Blu-ray. I mean, what I will say, it was released by Kino Lorber in the States as well. I mean, this is basically exactly the same disc and content. I mean, it's probably the best it's looked since it was first screened, all those years ago. But it doesn't look great. There's hairs on it and speckles and dirt and all sorts of stuff, and the grain. While there's nothing wrong with grain on film, it's some scenes it's really thick, heavy grain, which again kind of adds to sort of the student film type of look that I was mentioning earlier.
Oh, I found it added to the mystery of it.
I mean, yeah, in the same way. I mean, it depends on the scene, because some scenes, it was so heavy and thick, it was like I can't, I barely can see what's going on. Other scenes, it's barely noticeable. I mean, that's how grain is sometimes, but in this, it's not like pristine or anything like that. I mean, that is just down to the state of the negative. It's not the sort of film that is going to get thousands of dollars spent on a 4K scan of the original negative, and then all the instances of dirt and damage are going to be digitally removed, because that it's not a film that would shift enough copies to make it worthwhile doing. Not at this stage anyway. Maybe someone will take the time and money to do that at some point. But yeah, it's not the best looking disc I've ever seen. But like you say, that sort of rough and ready look to it kind of does add to the sort of the strange feeling that the film has. So it's not, that look isn't completely without merit. It's definitely worth checking out, I would say. And yeah, it was $7.99 on Amazon, so not expensive. I'm not sure how much the disc in the States is. And again, like I said, there's a DVD several years ago, which is probably still relatively simple to pick up. It's not streaming on Amazon or anything like that, I don't think. Not even to rent. I don't know about Netflix because I don't have it. But I mean, the other thing that we haven't mentioned, that it was actually remade a few years ago, back in 2014, by Spike Lee, The Sweet Blood of Jesus. And it's, so basically the same. I mean, the guy, the main character, is called Hess Green. Some of the other names have changed. It's got Rami Malek in it, who obviously recently won an Oscar as playing Freddie Mercury. Spike Lee has taken what he's done and changed it slightly, obviously, but I think the basic plot is still there. I would assume that narratively it probably is a little bit less ambiguous and that. But although what I've read about it is still quite an art house picture. He hasn't changed it into some commercial, stock vampire flick. It's still, from the sounds of it, it still keeps the spirit of the original.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great disc. I watched the There's a short documentary on there where they're talking about the film, and then those guys are also on the commentary. It's well worth checking the commentary out. There's some really interesting kind of tidbits on there. And they've got Marlene Clark, who was amazing in this film as well. She's quite elegant, but then she's also quite erotic as well. I think the whole film's kind of, it's very lustful and erotic, which is kind of what a perfect vampire film should have.
Absolutely.
Is eroticism and blood and death and and stuff like that. So I mean, it's kind of, to me, a kind of a perfect vampire film. If you don't know it, and you like stuff that is a bit odd and challenging, and you like, I mean, it's not there's no fangs or anything like that. There's nothing there in it. But I would say I recommend this film, definitely. I'm very happy you chose this one, because I probably wouldn't have.
Good.
I wouldn't have. Well, I may have come across it eventually, but yeah, I thought it was a masterpiece. And that was Ganja and Hess. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Hit the subscribe button over there, and don't forget to push that bell for notifications. There's some other videos to check out over here. Come and find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and come back next week for another video.